Every safety rule on the plane you last flew was written because someone died before it existed. The cockpit voice recorder, the ground proximity warning system, the sterile cockpit rule, the black box mandate, crew resource management training. None of them existed before the crashes you are about to see. Someone had to die first. Many people did. And the rules that came out of those deaths are the reason you landed safely the last time you flew. So why did it take 4 separate disasters before the FAA made a cockpit recorder mandatory? Who decided a pilot's instinct alone was good enough until it wasn't? Those are the questions this video answers. Not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen, who knew, and how long it took before anyone with real authority did something. These are the 5 crashes that rewrote the rules. In order. With receipts. Now, before we walk you through these major crashes, why it happened, the critical decisions that has been made, and how it has shaped everything in aviation forever, I want you to do something real quick. Hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our next videos. If you've done that, let's continue. Commercial aviation is statistically the safest way to travel in human history. You are more likely to be hurt driving to the airport than flying anywhere in the world. But that safety record did not arrive by design. It arrived because people died in ways nobody predicted. And those deaths forced investigators, regulators, and airlines to change things they never thought needed changing. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board are not proactive organizations. They do not sit in a room imagining everything that could go wrong and building rules around those scenarios. They wait. They wait for something to go wrong, investigate it carefully, write a report, issue recommendations, and then, sometimes years later, those recommendations eventually become mandatory law. Since the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 created the Federal Aviation Administration as the governing authority over American skies, nearly every major safety mandate in American aviation has come after a crash, not before one. The system was not designed to prevent the first disaster. It was designed to make sure the same disaster never happened twice. The rules protecting you on your next flight were not written by people imagining the worst. They were written by people standing in fields, pulling black boxes out of wreckage, listening to the final seconds of a recording, and asking the same question every time. What did we miss? And how do we make sure it never happens again? Every time a flight attendant tells you to stow your tray table, that instruction exists because of what you are about to see. Every warning alarm in a cockpit has a crash behind it. Every time a co-pilot challenges a captain's decision, there is a tragedy behind that too. Nothing in aviation safety appeared from nowhere. Everything came from somewhere. And the somewhere is almost always a disaster. We start with the crash that created the most basic rule of all. The one you will not be able to believe was never required in the first place. We begin in Chicago, December 8, 1972. United Airlines Flight 553 lifts off from Washington, District of Columbia, bound for Midway Airport. 61 passengers and crew members settle into their seats for what should have been a routine 2-hour flight. They never arrive. 2 miles short of the runway, the Boeing 737 drops out of the sky and into a residential neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. 43 passengers die, 2 crew members die, 2 people on the ground inside their own homes die. A total of 47 people who woke up that morning with no reason to believe it would be their last day. The engine failed on approach. That is what physically happened. But when the National Transportation Safety Board finished its investigation, what they found underneath that engine failure was something far more troubling. The crew had been given incorrect performance data, and when the engine failed at that critical moment, there was no single standardized emergency procedure telling them what to do. Not because the procedure didn't exist, but because every airline in America had its own version of it. Nobody at the federal level had ever looked at that gap and called it what it was. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded, "The accident revealed critical deficiencies in crew coordination and emergency procedure standardization." In plain language, pilots across the United States were not being trained to the same standard, and the Federal Aviation Administration had never stepped in to unify any of it. Nobody noticed how dangerous that was, not until 47 people were dead in Chicago. Within 2 years, the Federal Aviation Administration began requiring standardized emergency training across all American carriers for the first time. But the crash also set something larger in motion. Investigators began asking whether crews were trained to function together as a single unit under pressure, not just whether individual pilots were competent. That question would take years to fully answer. Keep that thought. Now we move 3 weeks forward. Same year, different state, worse outcome. December 29, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departs Kennedy Airport bound for Miami. 176 people on board. The aircraft goes down into the Florida Everglades. 101 people die. The cause was not weather, not mechanical failure, not anything the engineers who built that aircraft had failed to account for. What brought down Eastern 401 was a burned-out light bulb, a single indicator light, confirming the nose gear had locked for landing, failed to illuminate on approach. The captain, first officer, and flight engineer all turned their attention to it, all three of them. So completely absorbed in diagnosing a malfunctioning bulb, not one of them noticed the aircraft had quietly begun descending on autopilot. For 4 full minutes, a 250,000-pound aircraft sank silently and unnoticed toward the Everglades. By the time anyone looked at the altimeter, there was nothing left to do. What makes this impossible to file away as simple tragedy is what the National Transportation Safety Board found. The risk of exactly this kind of failure. An entire crew so fixated on one problem they lose awareness of everything else. Had already been identified in internal safety reports before this crash. Researchers had even named it crew attention tunneling. The warning was already in writing. The mandate to act on it was not. The crash directly accelerated the Federal Aviation Administration's requirement for cockpit voice recorders on all commercial aircraft. But beyond the hardware, it forced the industry to confront something it had been avoiding. If 3 experienced professionals could all stop doing their jobs simultaneously without any one of them catching the others, the entire structure of authority inside a cockpit needed rethinking. Before Eastern 401, cockpit culture was rigidly hierarchical. The captain was the final word. First officers were trained to support and comply, not to challenge. And questioning the person at the top was not something most co-pilots felt permitted to do. After Eastern 401, that philosophy began to crack. The investigation laid the groundwork for a formal rethinking of how crew members communicate, how authority is shared, and who is not just allowed but required to speak up when something is wrong. That rethinking had a name. We will get to it very shortly. Eastern 401 was not a failure of the aircraft or the technology. It was a failure of culture, a cockpit culture that concentrated all awareness and authority in one person, left no structured system for the others to intervene, and paid for that gap with 101 lives. Here is the tightened version. We move forward 10 years. Same country, different city, and this time the cockpit voice recorder, mandated partly because of what happened in the Everglades, captured everything. January 13, 1982, Washington National Airport. A snowstorm is moving through the city. Air Florida Flight 90 sits on the ground, de-iced and cleared for departure. The Boeing 737 begins its takeoff roll. It never clears the city. Seconds after lifting off, the aircraft loses thrust and strikes the 14th Street Bridge, killing 4 people in their cars. It then plunges into the Potomac River. 74 of the 79 people on board die, 5 survive. It is January. The water is just above freezing. Every headline said the same thing: pilot error. And technically, that was not wrong. The crew had failed to activate the engine anti-ice systems. The de-icing procedure had been done incorrectly. But when investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder, the story became more complicated. The first officer had noticed something was wrong, not once, but multiple times. He raised concerns about the engine readings on the ground. He was dismissed. On the runway, engines spooling up. He said it again. Dismissed again. In the final seconds before the aircraft hit the bridge, he said, "Larry, we're going down, Larry," the captain said. "I know it." 4 words from a man who saw sight coming and could not stop it. 3 words from a man who understood, too late, that his co-pilot had been right. That exchange became one of the most studied pieces of audio in aviation safety history, not because it was dramatic, but because it captured a system producing exactly the outcome it had been built to produce. The investigation found a deficiency that implicated the entire industry. Co-pilots were not empowered to forcefully intervene when a captain made a dangerous decision. Total authority at the top, total deference everywhere else. The first officer on Air Florida 90 was not weak or inattentive. He was operating exactly as he had been trained. That was the problem. What followed was the most significant structural change to cockpit culture in aviation history. The Federal Aviation Administration mandated crew resource management training across all American commercial carriers. For the first time, a first officer did not merely have the right to challenge a captain. He had a professional and legal obligation to do so. The cockpit stopped being a monarchy. A system replaced it. Now we move 7 years forward to a flight that should not have been survivable, and very nearly was. July 19, 1989. United Airlines Flight 232, a Douglas DC-10, departs Denver bound for Chicago with 196 people on board. An hour into the flight, the tail-mounted engine disintegrates, sending debris through all 3 of the aircraft's hydraulic lines at once. Hydraulic systems move everything on a commercial aircraft. Every surface that gives a pilot control over direction and speed. When all 3 lines failed, the crew did not lose some of their control. They lost all of it. An off-duty United Airlines training captain named Dennis Fitch was traveling as a passenger. He walked to the cockpit and offered to help. Captain Alfred Haynes accepted. For the next 44 minutes, 4 men worked to control an aircraft with no conventional means of being controlled. By increasing thrust on one engine and reducing it on the other, they could induce crude, imprecise turns. It was not flying, but it was something. They brought the aircraft to Sioux City Gateway Airport. At touchdown, the right wing dropped and struck the runway. The aircraft broke apart and caught fire. 111 people died. 185 survived. There was no training for what that crew did, because the scenario had never been considered worth training for. Simultaneous failure of all 3 hydraulic systems had been calculated as too improbable to design against. Then it happened. The Federal Aviation Administration mandated that hydraulic systems on transport aircraft be physically separated, routed through different parts of the airframe, so no single event could sever all of them at once. The idea that probability was the same as impossibility was retired. Beyond the hardware, Sioux City became proof that crew resource management worked. 4 people who'd never trained together functioned as a unit under conditions none of them had encountered. Captain Haynes said publicly, on multiple occasions, that without the communication discipline built through that training, none of the survivors walk off that aircraft. Before United 232, aviation assumed engineering could define the boundaries of what was possible. After it, the industry accepted that when the math turns out to be wrong, the only thing standing between the passengers and the ground is what the people in that cockpit have been trained to do together. The hydraulic separation requirement is on every commercial transport aircraft built after that ruling. It exists because of 44 minutes over Iowa. Here is the tightened version. We stay in Florida, but we move forward 14 years, and this time the failure did not belong to the crew. May 11, 1996. ValueJet Flight 592 takes off from Miami on a routine flight north. In the cargo hold are several chemical oxygen generators, the devices used to supply emergency oxygen to passengers. They are improperly packed, mislabeled, and should never have been on that aircraft. Minutes after takeoff, they ignite. The fire spreads. The aircraft plunges into the Florida Everglades at nearly 500 miles per hour. All 110 people on board die. You may know this crash. Budget airline, fire, Everglades. What the outline leaves out is what the investigation found underneath it. The National Transportation Safety Board traced the failure well beyond the aircraft. The generators had been improperly prepared by SaberTech, a maintenance contractor ValueJet used to keep costs down. One the Federal Aviation Administration had never formally inspected. The Federal Aviation Administration had also received multiple warnings about ValueJet's rapid expansion and safety culture. It had acted on none of them. The investigation concluded that the Federal Aviation Administration had failed to fulfill its safety oversight responsibilities. For a public that treated the agency as the final word on air safety, that sentence landed hard. The regulator, whose job was to prevent this, had been warned it was coming. The fallout was swift. The Secretary of Transportation, who had publicly called ValueJet a safe airline weeks before the crash, faced congressional scrutiny. ValueJet shut down and relaunched under a different name. What changed was not one thing. The Federal Aviation Administration was restructured, and its oversight mandate expanded. Fire suppression systems were mandated in cargo holds on all commercial aircraft. Hazardous materials rules were completely rewritten. Federal oversight of maintenance outsourcing was formalized into regulation for the first time. Global aviation standards bodies adopted strengthened cargo rules based on the findings, and European authorities followed within 2 years. Before ValueJet 592, airlines outsourced maintenance with minimal federal scrutiny. Cargo holds on many aircraft had no fire suppression, and the Federal Aviation Administration ran largely on trust. After it, every cargo hold on a United States commercial aircraft carries fire, detection and suppression equipment, and every maintenance contractor must meet federal approval standards. ValueJet 592 did not just kill 110 people. It exposed a practice that had been an open secret in the maintenance industry for years and forced a reckoning with a regulator that had quietly stopped doing its job. The fire suppression system in the cargo hold of your next flight traces directly to this crash. So does the federal requirement that someone was watching the people who last touched that plane. Here is the edit. Here is the lesson that runs underneath all 5 of these crashes. Aviation did not become the safest form of transportation in human history because the people involved were careful. It became safe because it was once catastrophically unsafe. And the investigations that followed were honest, enough to say so. And look, if you have made it this far, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. The next time you board a plane and the safety demonstration plays. Knowing's everything you now know about the crashes that made that procedure exist. What goes through your mind? Every industry operating at the edge of human capability faces the same choice. Learn from failure before it happens, or let the failure do the teaching. Aviation chose the second path for most of its history. These crashes are what forced the first. The uncomfortable truth is that the system works exactly as designed. The National Transportation Safety Board investigates. The Federal Aviation Administration regulates. But the trigger is almost always a crash, not a near miss, not a warning. A crash, which raises the question nobody in aviation likes to answer out loud. Is a system safe because it has never failed, or because it has survived its failures? Leave that one in the comments. And if you want the other side of this story, the 5 crashes that almost changed everything and didn't, that video is right here